Good morning, beautiful people. Welcome to another episode of Kiko's Freethinkers Forum. This is episode 46, and we're joined by a very special guest. Her name is Heather Berg, and she's an assistant professor at Washington University in St. Louis. And we're going to talk about her work from 2021. It's called Porn Work, Sex, Labor, and Late Capitalism. I have quite a few questions about the book. It's a well-written book. I learned so much just following all the content. And this forum is all about education, and having professors onto the forum is a really important part of the show. And so this is no less important. Bringing on Heather Berg today to talk with us about porn work, sex, labor, and late capitalism. And as far as I understand, she's working on something else as well with the sex worker left, which I don't know if we'll have time to talk about or not today. But I do want to say that she also earned an award, the CLR James Best Book for Academic or General Audience Award for this book, Porn Work. And I must say, if you guys have not read the book by CLR James, The Black Jacobins, I recommend that. It talks about the Haitian Revolution. I had to do a lot of that with my dissertation because my first chapter was about Haiti. But I want to say, Professor Berg, welcome to the show, and thanks for accepting that invitation.
Thanks so much. I'm glad to be here. And yeah, it was, I think, so so honored that the award is named after James. I just love his work. So I was like, such a thing to get.
Yes, absolutely. And again, my audience, they never know what to expect with these episodes. And it's kind of just the workings of my brain. If something interests me, I just really try to go for it. And I actually came across your book because I just read a lot in general. And I kept reading and I was like, wow, this is a really interesting book, and that's the first thing I thought about. I like to read books. And come from a PhD program, and just that's all we did in the program at UT Knoxville. And so I said, I have to get this person onto the show, to share more with the audience. Again, a beautiful cover. It's a pink cover book. And I think people have misconceptions about the word porn and the relationship with porn and the rest of society. I guess my first question would be, where is porn work and sex work? Are they interchangeable, or are they two different things? Because I think when people hear one thing, they hear something completely different. What would you say to that?
Yeah, I mean, so sex work is an umbrella term that sex worker organizers, and that's often associated with the movement in the 1980s, used to try to describe various kinds of work under one term. And part of the political utility of that, there were two things. One, Carol Lee, a sex worker activist who's coined the term, was trying to, and I think really beautifully, successfully, center the work rather than either ideas about like who sex workers were as people outside of their work. So part of this, the language that preceded the term sex work was, prostituted people, for example, was something she was reacting against. So she wanted to talk about, what it is we're actually doing, and this is sex work. And then the other piece is that she and others hoped the term, as an umbrella term, would undo what they call the hierarchy. So these hierarchies among sex workers, where, for example, porn workers have often been understood, and sometimes understood themselves, to be higher up on the hierarchy than people who do criminalized forms of sex work. So sex work as an umbrella term tries to undo that and really kind of unite around all of those things.
And we know that you're a professor currently at Washington University. What's been your journey, I guess in a condensed version, if you want to, and how does your personal life intertwine with the work that you do? Like, how do you get from point A to point B?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I had been involved in sex worker organizing before I did my PhD, and also just involved with and interested in labor organizing more broadly, and then pursued a PhD in feminist studies as a place that really let me ask the kind of questions that I care most about in a way that's not confined by disciplinary boundaries. Um, and it was during that time that the idea for this book project, which was my dissertation project, was born, and here we are. That's the short version. Part of what was happening during my first year in graduate school was a lot of conversations in Los Angeles, where a lot of porn is shot, around mandatory condom use. And I was really interested in something that may seem strange to listeners outside of this world, but many performers were allying with their managers against the law, which, if you think about, the history of occupational health law, seems really weird. So that was one thing that made me think about this industry in particular, something that I wanted to think more about.
Absolutely. And just been in academia myself, I'm currently in the job market. I think a lot of my audience knows this already, because I've recently got a PhD, and I was honestly hesitant. I didn't know if I was going to keep pursuing academia or not.
Yeah.
A lot of it is the political environment, honestly. And I guess the question that I'm getting at is, how has your work been received in academic circles? Because I know that within your own department, it may be more receptive, but let's just say the broader university, like, how do you think that your work is perceived?
Mhm. Yeah, I think some people think it's weird, for sure, but I felt a lot of support. And I think I try to formulate um, I tried to write the book, and just in general, in publishing, and when I do things like this, try to tell a story that makes sense to people who are sitting in different places. And so, I um, there's a piece of the book that labor historians, for example, have engaged with, and I've been really grateful for their letting me into their world, even though that's not my training. There are other folks who do, studies of digital media, for example, who have taken some piece and made it useful to them. So in that, I'm really grateful for that. I think in some ways, more than the porn piece, the anti-capitalist piece raises some heckles, and so if anything, that's where I sometimes have to navigate more negative reaction.
Yes, I'm curious about that because there are not the natural contradictions that arise. Just the premise of the book is interesting. You're using a Marxist lens. You're using a worker. The emphasis on like Marxist terminology, like workers, dialectics.
Yeah.
A lot of terms that I think my audience, like if they're not familiar with Marxism, they may be left, I guess, in the dark a little bit. But it's interesting because you emphasize that throughout the book. You have a lot of feminist thought that's not sex worker friendly. It's
Yeah.
and that's a pretty predominant faction of people in the country.
Mhm.
Um, that's what I was kind of getting at too. I'm surprised that your work has gotten, I guess, a lot more positive reception in academic circles. But I don't know if that's because if people are using the right gaze of feminism, that they can see that they're not as offended by that content. But just some of the people that I'm around in academia, for instance, they seem to be a lot more, I guess, closed off to these disciplines.
Mhm.
Even though we do gender studies, sexuality, but I know that there's also like levels to that, even within academia. It's like you can do things as long as you don't go too far against the status quo. And
Sure.
but when you start talking about Marxism, I feel like that could start to raise some eyebrows a little bit when you because that's attacking the political status quo at that point.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's so yeah, I guess there's a couple of things you're talking about there at all. So, I mean, one is the kind of anti-porn feminist response that has been hugely influential. So even people who aren't um, invested in feminist politics have absorbed anti-sex worker feminist ideas about what sex work and porn are. And you see that. So like, again, people who aren't reading Dorkin and McKinnon, for example, like still have this idea in their head And some of them I will never win. And the book is not a positive portrait of porn, is a workplace story. So I'm not trying to, I don't find the debate particularly interesting. But yeah, there are people who have absolutely absorbed those ideas, and no matter what I say, I could write, as I did, like 200 pages about how this is a mostly boring job, sometimes tedious, sometimes harmful, stories of workers organizing against their bosses. I could, write all of this and they'll still read it, and sometimes do, as a defense of porn, which is like, why, it's a reading comprehension issue, but also a political one. So there's that. And so certainly that I encounter that. And then I think, as you say, yeah, the anti-capitalist piece, um, uh, is troubling for some in a different way. And there's this whole other category of readers who don't have a problem with porn, but have a problem with the way I talk about managers, not the way I do, the way workers in the book talk about managers. Yeah, so that's certainly something that I find, but I guess I'm just more interested in talking to the people who are willing to meet me there.
I'm curious, just because I'm familiar like with porn just as a general, just like idea and just like what happens in porn, but I think it's really cool, like just describing those working conditions, because I think that does demystify a lot of these misconceptions about
Mm-hmm.
porn. Like it's just regular work,
Yeah.
and I think that was a really important observation that I picked up through the book. I don't think that people outside that don't follow porn necessarily understand that, because there's, like you said, the debate issue in itself. I'm not really too interested in that either. But I'm curious, what would be 2 or 3 things, I guess, studying, like interviewing over 80 people, producers and performers. Um, what would be 3 things that you think that the audience just in general would be surprised to hear about as far as porn is concerned, to sort of signify that this is just a regular job?
Yeah, I like that question. I guess before I answer it, I'll just say one more thing in terms of the reception, which is that I think one of the reactions to the book that I've been most kind of proud of is people from academics to other kinds of workers who aren't porn workers, but who see a reflection of their own experiences of work in the book. And and it was gave a talk at a academic library, for example, and the librarian who gave the intro said, like, oh man, like this feels so much like library work. So I love those moments, and I care so much more about those audiences than about anti-porn feminists who are invested in their own thing. And yeah, there are so many moments where the porn workers who animate the book are kind of gesturing out to readers, who are differently situated. And I think, there's a really like important politics to that too in sex worker organizing, where sex workers are more and more saying, like, sex work is bad in the ways other jobs are bad. What if we got together and made them less bad?
Mhm.
So that's so exciting to me. But to your question, the three things that are surprising is what you asked.
Mhm.
Yeah, I guess, it's hard for, like, surprising to who, I maybe to like your, kind of general imagined reader outside of this world. I think, um, I guess I can speak to that for different audiences. I think readers who are are educated and about and involved with labor politics in straight or non-sex work, find themselves surprised by the extent to which, and this is a really tricky thing, but it's also true, that most porn workers would rather not have any boss at all than have a boss that has been, kind of better disciplined by a union or better public policy. And so that's surprising, and also, a challenge to the kinds of organizing that have been most legible in labor movements. So that's one piece. I think, folks who come to the book most interested in the sexual politics piece, and perhaps those who entered in with ideas about porn and other sex work as like uniquely exploitative, unique places where consent is uniquely difficult to access, might be and have been surprised by the workers who I quote in the book saying that the kinds of the murkiness around consent that you feel here isn't so different from the murkiness that a lot of women feel around consent, whether they're getting paid for sex or not. And in fact, that many people say they feel more autonomy and more power when they do get paid, in part because the conventions of heterosexual life make actually talking about consent really hard. Whereas in sex work, like that is absolutely just an expected part of your workday that you will have these conversations. And so I think that's another thing that might surprise some people. I'm trying to think of a good third one. Maybe, again, just thinking about the kind of a reader who might have the least exposure to this. Another thing that might be surprising is that sex workers overwhelmingly say that they want less state intervention, and rather than to kind of explain themselves in such a way that policymakers will understand. And this just comes from a really long historical memory that sex workers have, where the state has always, time and time again, sought to regulate sex work in ways that have nothing to do with the well-being of workers. So I don't know, those things aren't surprising to me anymore at this point, but might be to some listeners.
No, I think that those were excellent responses, because no, there will be, because my audience is pretty international. I say a third of the listenership and viewership is outside the United States.
Okay.
So, but we're talking about working class people, professional class,
Yeah.
a large array of people, and some of those audiences are going to be more conservative in disposition, and I think that's the reason why a lot of this politicking that goes on outside of sex work is so effective, is because they have been able to tap into conservative elements of the country, because they know that but it's just like with any issue. If you're given an issue, if you haven't taken the time to sort of delve into it, you may just repeat what someone taught you about it, whether it's your parents or whoever it is. And so if you don't have an intimate relationship with that topic, then it's easy for someone to sort of guide the conversation for you. And I feel like with sex, that is already a topic that's very much put on the fringes for whatever reason, even though it's a very universal thing. It's been put on the fringes, and people they know that it's been put on that kind of a pedestal, pushed to the side. But the point you made in the book, you were talking about how it's it's just like any other job. If anything, the most cool thing about sex work is just the creative loopholes that performers have used to to help make more money,
Absolutely.
to take advantage of I guess the decentralization of the system.
Yeah.
I thought that was interesting. You said that the porn industry is not really an industry per se. What do you mean by that when you said that?
Yeah. I mean, so this too is just something that anti-porn feminists and conservatives talk about, this like behemoth, well-organized, centralized industry, as if there's like one group of like, old white men like making decisions. And there have been periods in porn's history in which it looks a little more like that. Never quite in the way that it's described. But if you look at what we're actually looking at here, it's OnlyFans self-producers who, with their iPhone in bedrooms across the world, are making their own content. And they're still like obviously centralized owners of platforms. Like they're the company that owns Pornhub has a major monopoly All of that's true, but it's the idea that there is an industry with a kind of centralized group of workers and managers that are making decisions in a coordinated way. It just isn't the case, and I can speak to that, you know, not just from the perspective of the book research, but now I'm on the board of the organization that sets health protocols for the industry. And one of the challenges is like, to whom are we? You know, like there's no, uh, it's not like the auto industry or something where like there is a body to which you might make the appeal. And there are ways that workers can use that, and as you said, really creatively to get their money in ways that are really exciting. And there are also ways that the kind of diffusion of the industry makes it harder to organize. I mean, that's the most obvious, is that it can be harder to organize when you don't actually know your coworkers, right?
I'm curious, again, just reading the book, there was just a plethora of information. And honestly, I urge my audience, don't be turned off by the title. Like, you will learn so much from reading this book. You talk about the history. You start out talking about the history of porn with the golden age in the
Yeah.
70s, and how the pay was so low back then. But you've also shown the transformation over the years. But you also point out the unfortunate disparities, the racial disparities, the sexualized disparities in the industry, which is just like any other workplace
Yeah.
in the country. I'm curious though, before I get into some of that, I wanted to kind of not attack, but sort of direct myself towards the whole idea of Marxism in the book itself.
Mhm.
When I was reading this book, I got one word kept sticking in my head. It wasn't Marxism, even though you used a Marxist sort of like analysis and the terminology and everything else, because I'm pretty familiar with it. I got libertarianism, honestly.
Yeah.
If I could take one word, it was libertarianism, and I guess you can, because I identify as a left libertarian, and
Hmm.
in the libertarian socialist type of vein,
Yeah.
and I definitely got a lot of that. I feel like porn itself is very much a libertarian. Um, the whole idea of like body autonomy, like taking ownership of your body,
Mhm.
expressing your body the way you want to. Most of the libertarians that I know don't believe in decriminalizing sex work at all. And that's how I guess that's the way I took it, but maybe I'm completely off on it as well. Just like lowering the state's presence, like to me, that's very much a libertarian type of concept.
Yeah, and I would say like a lot of socialists who are decidedly not libertarians also read sex work politics this way in a negative sense, you know, because they
Mm,
see porn workers, and so, you know, I'm repeating what the workers demand, and I really believe like any kind of socialist politics needs to follow what workers say that they want. In this case, it is less state intervention. Um, so yeah, so some people read that as libertarian, and you know, and I think for readers like you, that's not a bad thing. I For me, and I my politics are, you know, if you do that quadrant thing, right,
right.
it's, you know, absolutely on the anti-authoritarian left, which is the a kind of language that I prefer, because I think libertarianism like absolutely doesn't make sense as a framework to think about redistributive justice. um
Mm,
I'm not, and so I can speak for myself, but also I think that so much of my own politics come from sex worker organizing, and the example of the sex workers that I'm inspired by. And there, I think it's not a libertarian critique, but rather a critique of capitalist states rather than, you know,
mm,
of intervention as such. And there's a whole, you know, a whole other conversation, right, about like, do we want a dictatorship of the proletariat, or, you know, like, is there any kind of state intervention we would welcome? And that's, I think, another question. It's something I'm interested in my second book, but for our purposes here, I do try to push back in the porn workbook against the idea that this is a libertarian critique. But when porn workers are refusing state intervention, that they don't want the state to come in and solve problems that the state has in fact created, which like certainly some libertarians will feel some kinship there, but I think that the contours of the critique are a little bit different. And I guess the only other thing I'll say is you're absolutely right. There's a ton of libertarian porn workers and sex workers. I think, you know, for my own part, and this is where like it's my voice, not just presenting what others think. I think that there are a lot of gaps in that approach, most especially where it prefers a kind of value neutral entrepreneurialism as a solution to as something that, as you say, you know, is just marked by extreme social inequality. So all of that's true, which is, I think, a muddled answer to your question. But yeah, I think it is, for me, what I'm trying to get across is an anti-authoritarian left perspective on these problems. I think libertarians will find some moments of that feel right, and others that will necessarily be contradictory.
Yeah, but I guess what I would add to that is that I believe that the libertarians, I think, that we're talking about, I won't say that they've co-opted the word, but
right.
Original libertarians were not associated with the people that we're talking about. The original libertarians were part of the left. They like that's where the tradition came from.
Totally.
And I think for some reason, people like myself, that we're almost put on an island because, and I think it's because people the labels have kind of just thrown everyone off, and they don't know exactly what that is because it's hard to pinpoint. It's like a constant moving target, and you're trying to find, you know, some kind of consistency, but it goes away, you know.
Totally. Yeah, and then it's like, so even in our conversation, like someone could take out an excerpt and you know, make it seem like a support of something that I don't think either of us is supportive of at all. But yeah, I mean, that I think that history is really crucial. And there are a lot of folks in the I won't say industry, right, but the community, such as it is, who I think are more attached to I think in the true spirit of libertarian politics, like this focus on free speech, you know, the history of like Victoria Woodhull and like the folks who are thinking about porn from that lens. I don't find that as politically useful. I'm just not that interested in the content question. But I don't find libertarian politics particular in either manifestation particularly valuable for thinking about labor rights. But yeah, it's absolutely agree. I mean, it's just hard to even have the conversation because some people use this term and what they really mean is like an anarcho-capitalist perspective. Yeah. So it's just it's a mess.
And I definitely don't mean that perspective at all, but it's just, and another thing with the forum, and my audience is pretty familiar with it. I tell people just connect the dots because I bring on all different types of guests. But we sort of operate with a framework like outside of the two-party system. Like that's pretty much the framework. And we sort of build just topics as like a way to sort of coalition build. And or at least I'd be proud just for people to sort of have their own autonomy as far as political thought, their own autonomy as far as their life is concerned. At least it's you, like you came to that conclusion on your own and you can sort of navigate this difficult environment that we're in any way you see fit. And that's kind of the purpose, and I think it's working. You know, it takes a long time. You have to break down and debunk all these different, you know, misconceptions, but you never debunk it unless you talk to the people yourself. You have to talk to the people directly to get those answers. And I was, like I said, you talked to over 80 people in the book. And you highlighted Connor in particular. I've seen you do interviews, like you've done so many interviews, and Connor has been with you. And I never got that. I understood the worker part. Is that the reason why you emphasize work so much in the book? Is that to just emphasize the labor part more so than anything else? Because I don't think you use porn star at all in the book
Yeah.
because you made that point known that relatively speaking, there are not many stars in porn.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'll just say for folks who haven't read the book, this is Connor Habib, just in case you want to look him up. He's also a podcaster and a sex worker theorist and activist. And features heavily in the book. So Kiko's talking about this moment in the introduction where at the end of our interview, Connor corrects me having used the term porn worker throughout, which is a term that a lot of people that I interviewed appreciated, but he said like, hey, why aren't you using porn star? And I explained why. This is a worker lens, a labor lens. And he said, yeah, but I don't want to be, or the direct quote is, I'd rather be a constellation than a worker. And he's an anti-capitalist thinker. And then later, this was when we met, I think in 2014, and then we became friends. And later, as the book got closer to publication, he said like, hey, I want you to add something because I don't actually think that in quite the same way anymore. So his own ideas changed. And so in some way, like this friendship developed where we changed each other's ideas about it. And he started to think about, as he puts it, and I quote this in the book, we should claim the term worker in order to misuse it, which I think is really beautiful. And then, for my part, what shifted is that I stopped wanting to tell a story about like porn is work like any other, which is kind of what I wanted to do initially, to correct the stigma and say like, this is just a job, but it's really not for a lot of people. It's something that, in Connor's language, he says, I give, and he's no longer performing, but I give and receive pleasure, not misery. Work is giving and receiving misery, which is just like such an incredible rejoinder to this whole like manufactured debate. And I'm much more interested in where that gets us rather than like, yeah, is this exploitation or not? Of course it is. All work is like, what next? And I think he's getting us to the what next.
Yes, I like that for sure. Yeah, that never went in my mind reading it, but like you said, I mean, depending on who you talk to, I mean, work is exploitative. I mean,
Yeah.
and that's the cool thing I got out of it. Is you have that in any industry. I mean, this is no different. When I read this book, I was genuinely trying to learn more, just generally as far as information. Like I almost forgot for a second that we were even talking about porn work. When I was reading the book, I was like, okay, this is, it's pretty boring stuff that they do. And just I thought the way you described the inner workings of just like a set was interesting. Just with supplying the lubricants, how certain studios are under budgeted. Like if you talk about some of the Black performers, the interracial dynamic, how it's only used for Black men with non-Black women performers. Like that's a terminology in itself. Like that stuff is really interesting, but it also shows a lot of the disparities in porn and how it also has a long way to go when it comes to like equity.
Absolutely. I mean, and I think part of what I find so frustrating about the conversation more broadly is that like people who think porn is uniquely hierarchical and exploitative exist in their own lives, rely on exactly these forms of racist exploitation. So, like the same people who and like this is absolutely a problem, it should absolutely be criticized, but people use like that information to say that porn is terrible and then turn around during a pandemic and hire an overwhelmingly Black workforce to do their grocery shopping for them on Instacart for pennies. I mean, and feel okay about that because people's clothes stay on. And so, I'm interested in revealing the racist inequality of the porn industry for sure, which is something that my dissertation advisor, Murray Miller-Young's book, A Taste for Brown Sugar, does in a historical and contemporary vein, just really beautifully for folks who are interested. But I'm equally interested, right, in revealing those conditions and also like throwing it back on people who like to pretend it's unique, which I think is just such an insidious aspect of anti-sex work ideas is that it allows people to feel okay about the kinds of exploitation they experience and participate in and perpetuate. And the historical, version of that is all of these white reformer feminists who were like absolutely in a lather about prostitution and who were going down to pick up Black women, day labor maids, paying them nothing, with terrible working conditions, high incidence of sexual assault by their own husbands. I mean, so all of this, and it's these same people feeling absolutely righteous in their practices, and also righteous in their exceptionalizing of the sex industry.
No doubt. And I guess before we go back to that, I wanted to also point out that again, I think the descriptive element is I don't know if that was your intention, just by describing what actually happens, like on the porn sets themselves, is like such a monotonous type of like routine.
That was definitely my intention. Yeah.
It's just, but I guess that lowers the inhibitions of people who may have these like loaded kind of thoughts approaching porn. I think that's the best way to do that is just to simply describe what's going on. And just, I don't think people, if that was the case, everyone would be in porn if it was easy. It's not an easy job.
No, it's hard.
It's just like every job has a set of skills, and some of these sets take hours. I was surprised to learn about that myself. I mean, I think you described one of them like it took us up to 5 hours. I mean, I don't know if that's because of travel and everything else, but just these people performing throughout the day like multiple times, and just think, I mean, having to like have an erection or whatever it is. I mean, like this is work. This is not something that anyone can just do. And I thought that was important, just the detail that you went into as far as describing what these people go through.
Thanks. Yeah, I wanted to kind of drop the reader into the boringness of the set. I think some people, pick up books about porn and want their own titillating experience, and I tried to do the opposite. So, but yeah, I mean, it could be 5 hours, and as a recent PhD, you have this memory too of like what it feels like to get paid the same amount, regardless of whether your work takes an hour or 10. I mean, and so when that's the case, whether it's like grading papers or shooting a scene, management has no incentive to make your work less burdensome or more efficient. The pay is exactly the same, and graduate workers are on strike all over the country for exactly this reason. So yeah, I just mentioned that as another, like I as I was writing that when I was a graduate student, and I was like, oh yeah, this is exactly it. So
I'm curious, but again, a lot of what you describe in the book is it talks about gradients, scales. So you're exploiting the contradictions in porn in a way, because it is portrayed. I think once you've accepted it, the premise that like porn is like, this is something that I want to gravitate towards. There is this dark side of porn, and a lot of it is the levelings of people. I was surprised to hear that gay performers made so much compared to other groups, and white females and the gay demographics especially, compared to like some of the other performers. Is such a disparity in the pay.
Huge. Yeah.
And is that only because of what the market is saying, or is that also because of internalized features in porn itself?
Yeah, I mean, so first I'll just say that here for listeners, we're talking about kind of more traditional studio model of porn. Things are absolutely hierarchized, but in a different way when we're thinking about self-produced scenes on like OnlyFans. So I'll answer the question in terms of where you have agents, producers, directors making the decision. And yeah, the disparities are huge. they all say, and when I asked them, they said, oh yeah, it's the market. Or they always talk about like this kind of symbolic, like racist white consumer. And they always say like, oh, in the South, or in like, well, now I live in Missouri. So it's always like the Midwest, right? So there's this like other person responsible for these racist disparities. They never acknowledge they're making the decision, of course, which is much like managers elsewhere. Um, but but this argument actually doesn't hold up at all, because the market, such as it is, for what's called like interracial or urban content is huge. Those scenes in traditional, the numbers again are hard to get now because of the dissemination, and like so, but we know this in terms of even download numbers for stuff on like Pornhub. The market, the consumer interest in these scenes is very high, and still Black performers are paid so much less. So it really is not, it doesn't make sense in terms of, this is part of why like classical economics is a lie, because it's actually like, that's not how any labor markets work, but they're cross-cut by racism in all these sorts of ways. So yeah, so it's not the market. And again, you know, Dr. Miller Young's book gets at this in a much more dedicated way, thinking about like the, as she right, the taste for brown sugar. Like there's a taste for this, there is a demand, and yet these the women performers that she interviewed and looks at historically are just time and time again find that their labor is demanded and yet not compensated.
You also have within the porn industry, like the adult video news, and I
Right.
know that they have their big awards ceremonies, and to me, I make the comparison with like the Grammys or the
Yeah.
Oscars or the Emmys. I think it was just this past one, the first Black female won the Adult Video News Award out of all those years. I think this is the first year that a Black performer even won, a Black female had won. So it shows that no, there's definitely a hierarchy in place when it comes to the actual, I guess, the inner workings of porn, the consumerism aspect of it. The, there's a lack of recognition. It's really it's a human rights thing. And I think you said Lexington Still pointed this out, um, and Prince Yeshua, I think is the way you pronounce his name, one of the performers. And I think the Black performers are very conscious of this, and they just sort of roll with the punches because they know, I guess, they know what they're getting into as far as that's concerned. Like it's no different than the world that they were in before they got
Right.
into porn.
Right.
And in a way, that's um, disincentivizing, I guess, in a way. It de incentivizes Black performers wanting to get into porn because in that way it's very closed off, I guess, as far as the mindset. Like, how do you change those mindsets within the industry? I know you proposed something, a scenario where if the pay rates were the same for
Mhm.
everybody, there would still be people complaining about no, but I'm making more numbers than everyone else. And I
Yeah.
saw you make that point in the book as well.
Yeah. And again, now, like even that proposal makes no sense, because people are working not entirely, but often with you know, without management, and then so they're subject to algorithmic racism, which is a different but no less crushing problem. I think to your question about, you know, whether this disincentivizes Black performers from taking on porn work, I think it often doesn't, for the same reason that lots of people do, which is that like as you say, these hierarchies exist everywhere. And I think, you know, for folks wanting to read a first person account of this, Tyler Knight's memoir is really wonderful. He's a Black performer who writes about, there's just one moment in the memoir where he starts to he's part of it is tracking, like he's trying to retire from the porn industry. And he talks about like the kind of office jobs that might be available, which were, you know, absolutely like subject to all sorts of racist, both microaggressions and, pay inequality and all of that. But he also just talks about like, now I have to like ask someone's permission to pee, like these kinds of daily degradations, which, obviously all workers experience some version of that, but the ways that gets cross-cut by racism are impossible to overestimate. And so it doesn't actually disincentivize. And in fact, often like racism in straight or non-sex work jobs pushes people toward sex work, because even though there are all of these racist hierarchies, there's sometimes a little bit more room to maneuver. And yet, you hit like, the same kinds of, systems on the other side too. So that's the double bind for sure.
I have two more questions for you. One's more or less a burning question, and the other one is more about something that you highlighted pretty extensively towards the end of the book.
Sure.
The first question has to do is, do you self-identify as a Marxist?
Yeah.
Okay, so with that in mind, where do you see the problems with the intersection of racism and Marxism? Because that's something that I've had to grapple with. Like, I'm a leftist, but I've almost divorced myself from any kind of a terminology when it comes to like socialism, Marxism. Not because of stigma, but simply because I don't know if I quite understand it just based on my lived experiences.
Yeah.
And I think that's where sort of like the Marx was a white Jewish guy in Europe in the 1850s or whatever. I think that's kind of what messes with my head some. Like, to me, there's really a disconnect, because it's always referring back to something back then. I understand that it has an impact now, but I feel like that there's limitations within thought when you talk about race and class. Where will you see those potential problems as a Marxist, and even just within navigating the idea of porn work and seeing the racist elements even when you were doing the book?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think similar, like to call back to our conversation about the language of libertarianism, is like we call ourselves things so that we can try to find our intellectual and political community, but the words don't mean this, so there are a lot of Marxists who would not claim me, and a lot of Marxists I would not claim. I'm a bad Marxist in a lot of ways. And and so anything like orthodox Marxism, I have no interest in. And so I don't mean to get too jargony for listeners, but like there's all sorts of camps like within folks. And I think in some ways it's not that helpful to like use, even as you say, like Marxism suggests this kind of fealty to this one white guy, which is like not the point. And he had a ton of things that he missed around race, around gender, around informal labor, which is linked to his lack of racial analysis. So all of that is true. I'm not that interested in. I mean, I do find Marx himself useful sometimes, but that's really not the point. I'm in conversation with people who, for a lot of different reasons, use Marx to make sense of the very specific other objects, right? So like Angela Davis reads Marx to make sense of a totally different moment, and I find her reading more useful than the original. But we still call ourselves Marxists for some reason, right? And there's just so many Black radical thinkers who have done like things with Marx that again I find much more useful for our contemporary moment, not just because of like diversity or whatever in an amorphous sense, but because like these analyses speak better to the conditions of late capitalism, and I would say also to Marx's own moment, like it's just a truer picture of what capitalism does. What Black radical thinkers call racial capitalism, like that's what we're working against. So yeah, the name is like, I think, kind of muddling in some ways, but does that answer your question?
No, it does, for sure. I think it's something that's conscious even within the orthodoxy of Marxism, and that's the reason why it's avoided a lot of times.
Yeah.
These conversations have come up a lot recently. I say in the past 20, 25 years in Cuba, for instance. Like I really study Cuba, like that's one of my main countries of focus. And this question comes up a lot talking to Black people in Cuba, and just that whole question of giving into the revolution, but what does that mean when you give into something? What else has been left out? And this question always comes up, the whole idea of race, where does this fit in as far as the cause is concerned? It's always a big thing, how to balance. It's a constant balancing act, regardless of the being socialism, capitalism, Marxism, whatever it is. You mentioned SESTA in the book, and I want the listeners to know what that is and how has that affected the industry as we know it today.
Yeah, so in some ways the story kind of comes to a close, or my research comes to a close around the passage of FOSTA SESTA, which in 2018 were laws in at the federal level that the short version is that they made it so much harder for sex workers broadly, not just porn workers, but for sex workers broadly, to use the internet to share information with each other, to advertise their own services, and for in-person sex workers to screen clients for safety. So all of these things were, as anti-sex worker law always is, presented under the rubric of anti-trafficking, but not actually about trafficking. There's some debate about that, whether like lawmakers were just really clumsy and we're trying to do something good. I don't think so. I don't think anyone's like that dumb. But and sex workers had spent months leading up to this lobbying Congress and educating representatives about why this was going to make people more vulnerable. And so I just can't believe that this was just like an error. I think that as the sex worker theorist Irene Silt says, like, the state has always wanted sex workers dead. For me, this is like another in that long history, another episode in that longer history. So, and in the intervening years, there have been just increasing. Listeners are probably maybe have seen conversations around payment processors refusing to process payments for online porn. It's just one thing after another that sex workers are having to navigate a new crisis all the time. And these laws, and FOSTA SESTA is just one example of this. Again, they overwhelmingly make the work less safe. They take away workers' power, and they undermine the strategies that workers have used to protect themselves. And that's really it. There's like no factual other side, because again, it's not like there's no debate to be had. That's what they do. And the journalist Melissa Garrett Grant talks about how in the years since its passage, FOSTA SESTA has resulted in one single trafficking prosecution. Like one, and I'm a prison abolitionist. I don't think prosecutions are evidence of something having worked, but if the object was to reduce trafficking, it has just spectacularly failed. And thousands of sex workers are worse off because of it. People are dead because of it. And so, I think that's where I'll leave it. It's like it's a failure at what it said it wanted to do, and a real success if what is actually happening here. And I think that this is the case, and I don't mean to sound conspiratorial, but like all the evidence suggests that the point was to hurt sex workers.
No, there's nothing wrong with being conspiratorial. That's also been turned into a bad word.
Right.
No, I definitely agree with those sentiments about the intentionality behind the laws, for sure. Especially with these politicians, they know they're very much anti-sex work, anti-human rights in general. As long as it means just keeping all the power within, and not spreading any of that productivity for the workers themselves, and us sharing all that stuff together. They want to extract everything from us and keep it for themselves. And this seems to be the common link. But Professor Berg, I want to say thank you for joining us. And is there, like, in case a viewer or listener had a question, what would be the most effective, quickest way to get in touch with you?
Oh, yeah, minimize, like, if men porn viewers, do not email me wanting to discuss. This happens all the time. People are like, hello, I'm very lonely. I have
really?
questions. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry about that.
No,
Okay.
it's not your fault. No, I'm also joking. I can ignore the emails, but I'm just saying, if your questions are of that nature, pay someone to do this.
Yeah,
So
100%.
yeah. But yeah, folks can find me. Probably the easiest way is at Dr. Heather Berg on Twitter.
Well, that's revealing in itself, though, that that happens
Yeah,
as much as those. That's really unfortunate. That never even came across my head, but yeah.
it's I think a casualty of being a woman academic. You get this stuff, and it's not even, necessarily creepy, but just like folks feeling entitled to your energy. So
I got you.
yeah,
But
but I'm happy to
regardless,
answer
well,
genuine
like I
questions.
said, hopefully for my listener viewership,
No, I'm also
that's
just
the
joking.
case.
Yeah, that's good.
But
Yeah.
I had such a great time, and we'd be open to having you back on down the road too, because I know you're working on other projects as well, and we'd be glad to have you back. And this was a great episode 46, a lot of information. I urge my listeners to go buy Porn Work, and I think you're going to learn a lot. You're not going to be disappointed in what you see in the book. But I want to say thank you again, Heather, for coming out to the show. And beautiful people, episode 47, we're going to talk with Medea Benjamin from Cold Pink. We're going to talk about her new book, War in Ukraine, Making Sense Out of a Senseless War. And Norm Finkelstein is going to join us tomorrow to talk about his new book. And then next week, we're Sarah Walk. And my dad's going to be on episode 50 to close season 2 of Kiko's Freethinkers Forum. Have a great rest of your day, beautiful people, and we will talk soon. Cheers.
Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely.